My dear friends, tomorrow morning we will once again read the story of the Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And we will hear as Abraham is called by God to sacrifice his only son as a test of faith, and how at the very last second, an angel of God calls out and commands him to stop, saving Isaac's life and Abraham and Sarah's legacy. Now, I have been writing and delivering Rosh HaShanah sermons ever since my first high holiday pulpit in Walterboro, South Carolina in 1983. And each year, I have wrestled with this text and the many ethical, theological, and psychological problems that it poses, and I'm not alone. Philosophers, commentators, and rabbis from Rashi to Kierkegaard have tried to understand the messages and the purposes of this very complex narrative. And as I approach my last year as your senior rabbi, the quandary of the Akida still looms large. Now, one of the key issues that Abraham faces as he and Isaac go on their 3-day journey to Mount Moriah is the difficulty of holding on to two completely different and contradictory narratives. God is testing Abraham. God tells him to take his son, his only son whom he loves, and offer him up as a sacrifice. God has promised Abraham and Sarah that their descendants will be plentiful and that Isaac will be the progenitor of multiple generations. And herein lies his dilemma. You see, if Abraham sacrifices Isaac, then God's promise of future generations is nullified. But if he does not go through with this horrible deed, then he's disobeying his Creator. Both outcomes are untenable. And Abraham faces an existential crisis that challenges both his faith and the reality in which he lives. Even the ending of the narrative is chilling. When at the last minute, Abraham learns that this entire ordeal was a trial to measure his faithfulness, we are left with the question, what kind of God would torture someone with such a horrific test? Now, during the course of this past year, in the aftermath of October 7th, many of us have felt like Abraham. We too have been tested. Now, of course, our experience here in Denver pales in comparison with the pain that Israelis are experiencing and those who are in the line of fire. And yet, as the 1-year anniversary of the unspeakable horrors of the Hamas pogrom draws near, and the constant rocket attacks by Hezbollah, and in the shadow of the recent attacks on Israel from Iran, Jews around the world are dealing with several painful realities. The plight of the hostages in Gaza and the unbearable suffering that their loved ones are enduring as they wait for some glimmer of hope to emerge from this horrific situation. Yesterday's missile attacks by Iran made it perfectly clear that this is not merely a war between Hamas and Israel or Hezbollah, but rather it is Iran that threatens the peace and stability of the Middle East, if not the entire globe. We've experienced the frightening rise of anti-Semitism here in our country from both the far right and the far left. We have seen the well-coordinated and orchestrated anti-Israel and anti-Semitic protests on school campuses, on the streets, legislative halls, and public squares of every city around the country and around the world that utilize terms such as globalism, apartheid, colonialism, and racism to demonize Zionism and slander the state of Israel. And the sense of abandonment that many in the Jewish world are experiencing As we see former partners with whom we work side by side of issues of social justice now spouting anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic tropes that we thought were long buried in the ash heap of history. And of course, the verbal attacks on Israel as it fights a war it did not seek. And when it targets its enemies bent on its destruction, it is blamed for the deaths of innocents who are deliberately placed in harm's way. All of these have contributed to a sense of dread and uncertainty that have shaken us to the very core. And to top it all off, this is taking place against a backdrop of social and political upheaval in America as we approach yet another bitterly fought presidential election. The situation for Jews in America and around the world is rapidly changing. In the 42 years since beginning my journey to the rabbinate, I cannot recall another more precarious time. The fact that armed guards are now commonplace in every synagogue we enter, the ever-increasing budget lines designated for protective personnel and defensive building upgrades that take away needed funds for education and other programming, the many security protocols we have put in place are all testimonies to the fact that we are facing a dangerous period in our history. And perhaps more unnerving than all these factors is the increasing generational disconnect in our community as a not insignificant number of Jews, especially young Jews, are questioning the values, history, and underpinnings of Zionism. And they are using the very same rhetoric and language as those who strive to put an end to the state of Israel against their people. The phrases, free Palestine, from the river to the sea, and globalize the intifada are not new. We know what they mean. We understand that they are calls for the destruction of the state of Israel, and we expect to hear them from our enemies. But the pain and shock of hearing these very same phrases coming from the mouths of our fellow Jews, many of whom grew up in our congregations and in our homes, is another matter. I hope you know by now that I am a proud Zionist, and I'm not alone. And I know that many, if not most of you here tonight, share my views, and yet, increasingly, the connection between American Jews and Israel is being challenged by new norms and expectation that pose difficult questions we must ask ourselves. Are Zionism and Judaism really intertwined? Can't you be a Jew and an anti-Zionist? How do we deal with the sufferings of innocents caught up in the crossfire between Israel and its enemies in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon? What has been the impact of the policies of the current extremist government in Israel on Jews around the world who do not share in the triumphalist, fundamentalist, and all too often racist views of some of the members of Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet? Christian nationalism is on the rise in America. Now, while not all non-Jewish supporters of Israel are Christian nationalists, many far-right fundamentalist movements that love Israel often base their support on theological and ideological principles that share little, if anything, with our Jewish values. Can we truly feel comfortable marching side by side with those whose support of Israel is based on a triumphalist eschatological worldview and whose vision of a theocratic Christian America that includes the subjugation of women, condemnation of our LGBTQ plus families, friends, and neighbors, and tearing down the sacred walls separating religion and state? And most importantly, have we failed? Have we failed to teach the next generation about the vital connection between the land and the people of Israel? And so we American Jews, like Abraham, find ourselves holding multiple, sometimes contradictory narratives that expose both our fears and our failures at a time when we can least afford to be uncertain about ourselves, our values, or our future. And my friends, tonight as we welcome in a new year, we have no choice but to acknowledge that we are facing a turning point in our history. And one of the main issues that our Jewish community must address in the short term is the need to radically transform the way that we teach our children and ourselves, for that matter, about the essential call of Klal Yisrael, Jewish peoplehood. Now, we've done an excellent job of working for social justice. The universal push for tikkun olam, the repairing of our all too broken world, has no less value today than it did before October 7th. But has this emphasis on universalism moved us away from the importance of peoplehood? As Hillel taught, Im ein ani li nili uksha'ani la'atzmi ma'ani v'im lo achshav eimatai. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not, now when? Now, we Reformed Jews are experts in the second part of Hillel's maxim, Uksha'ani la'atzmi ma'ani. If I'm only for myself, what am I? And we should be proud of that fact. But I believe we've fallen short in relation to his primary statement, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? We've taught our children to look out and care for others, and this is as it should be. The ideals that fuel our movement's social justice initiatives are essential, but they cannot replace or supersede the importance of supporting our community in times of need, especially the state of Israel. And this leads us to the third part of Hillel's maxim. V'im lo achshav eimatai, if not now, when? If we do not act quickly to increase our emphasis on Klal Yisrael, the peoplehood of Israel, then we run the very real risk of distancing ourselves from the history and values that have sustained our people for millennia. And we also cannot afford to cut off the young people whose anger and angst about the state of Israel has caused them to protest. As much as we might disagree with them, they see this conflict as a human rights issue. And they are living out the very values we have taught them, if not in a misguided fashion. We have taught them that the pursuit of social justice is a central Jewish value. We have taught them to speak up for the powerless. We have taught them that we should not oppress the stranger, for we know the heart of the stranger, having ourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. And when they hear from others that Israel is an occupying and abusive power, when they are told that everything they have learned about Israel is false, when they repeatedly hear the lie that Israel is a racist, colonialist enterprise that is oppressing an indigenous population, they do not have enough information to confront and refute the sophisticated poison that flows directly from our enemies. And this is on us, my friends. There is no short-term magic pill that can address propaganda. Education about the history of the Jewish people and the values of Zionism takes time, resources, effort, and consistency. And it also takes courage to tell the whole story, not a sanitized version of the truth. Let me be clear. I love Israel, but Israel is not a utopia. The myth of Israeli infability is dangerous. Mistakes have been made over the past 75 years. Democracy and governance can be messy. Just look at our own country. When we hold Israel to an impossible standard of perfection, we do everyone a disservice and open the door to manipulation and misinformation. My friends, the task before us is difficult, but not impossible. For 2 millennia, Judaism has taught us how to disagree without alienating one another. We can't lose this now. It is said in the debates between Hillel and Shammai, two of the great leaders of our people, that the halakha, the Jewish law, often went on the side of Hillel, in part because he knew the opposing views and would lay them out before presenting his own. And so as such, it is vitally important that instead of cutting off our young people who actively oppose Israel and Zionism, we must open our doors and our hearts and bring them close. We should listen to them and hope that they in turn will listen to us. This doesn't mean that we should agree or support their beliefs, but rather it does mean that we want to engage them in true dialogue and let them know that they are not pariahs. We cannot afford to lose an entire generation. And similarly, as we teach our children and ourselves about the state of Israel, we must not sugarcoat the facts on the ground. Instead of ignoring or rejecting the problems facing the Jewish state, we need to work to improve them. And one powerful way to accomplish this is by supporting our reform movement in Israel. Now, some of you will remember that a year and a half ago, in April of 2023, I served as a delegate to the reform movement to a special meeting of the World Zionist Conference in Jerusalem. And there, in addition to celebrating Israel's 75th anniversary, we also debated and voted on key issues that face the worldwide Zionist movement. Now, the World Zionist Congress is a non-governmental gathering of every facet of the Zionist movement. Its main purpose is to set forward an agenda for education and allocation of resources from the World Zionist Organization and its affiliates, including ARTZA, the Association of Reform Zionists in America, that's us, Hadassah, B'nai B'rith, and other groups from the most ultra-Orthodox far right to the extreme left. And prior to the Zionist Congress, there is an election in which every organization and movement encourages its members to vote. And the more votes received, the more power and influence on policy a movement has. Now, the next conference will take place in fall of 2025. Elections will take place from March to May next year. Now, lest you think this is a trivial matter, let me assure you that it is not. While those of us who are not citizens cannot vote in Israeli elections, we can have a say in promoting and sustaining our values. Millions of dollars of funds and key leadership portfolios will be distributed from the Jewish Agency in Israel based on the results of this coming election. The platforms and policies funded by these resources will reflect the vote tallies. And by registering as a member of ARTZA and by casting your vote, you can and will make a huge difference. The far right did not do well in the last Zionist Congress elections. But this time they are well organized and have prepared a sophisticated smear campaign against the reform movement, calling us non-Jews and anti-Zionists. We cannot let this happen. And why is this important? Well, in the words of my friend and colleague, Rabbi Josh Weinberg, director of ARTZA, who has spoken here in our congregation, liberal Zionism is the insistence that there is no necessary contradiction between Israel's dual identity as a Jewish and democratic state, that Israel can be a national home and refuge for the Jewish people, while also embodying universal democratic principles of human rights and equality. Threading this needle, he writes, for liberal Zionists means Israel must adopt a more liberal set of policies, and most importantly, a two-state peace agreement with the Palestinians that allows both peoples to live with security and dignity and to allow for greater religious freedom and pluralism. And so I want you to do something tonight. As you leave services, you will notice that there are several posters in the foyer about registering to vote for the World Zionist Congress. There's a QR code on these posters that will take you to a website that will give you information about the World Zionist Congress and help you register to vote. I was going to put it up on the screen, but I decided we told you to turn off your cell phones, so I won't. But before you go home, take a picture of that QR code. And if you're not comfortable doing that, it's okay. All temple members will be receiving lots of information about the Zionist Congress in the next few weeks. But it is vitally important that every single one of you register and tell your friends to do the same. There will also be opportunities to get involved on a grassroots level here in Denver to help register as many people as possible. My dear friends, we are living in difficult times. And our hearts are turned toward Israel as it struggles against enemies within and without. But together we can make a difference. Now is the time to reinforce all of our values, the universal and the particular, those of Klal Yisrael and those that teach us to care for others. They are not mutually exclusive. Now is the time to remember the words of Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, Od lo avda tikvatenu. We have not lost our hope. The hope of 2,000 years to be a free people in our land, in the land of Zion and Jerusalem. Hatikva means the hope. The great British Lord and Rabbi, the late great British Lord and Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote the following. Many of us confuse two concepts, optimism and hope. They sound similar, but in truth they are very different. Optimism is the belief that things will get better. Hope is the belief that together we can make things better. To be optimistic requires no courage. A certain naivete suffices. But to hope requires great courage. No Jew who knows the history of their people, much of which was written in tears, can be optimistic. But no Jew, if they are a true Jew, can give up hope. And that is why Judaism for me is the voice of hope in the conversation of humanity. And hope is what changes the human condition. And so, my friends, as we begin a new year, let us journey together with hope in our hearts. Let us work and pray for peace and reconciliation. And let us all say Amen. L'Shana Tova.